Of all the media revenue models, subscriptions can be the most tricky to execute well. There are just so many variables at play that impact a publisher's ability to succeed. You have to figure out what to place both in front of and behind your paywall, how to price your subscription, how to convert free readers into paid subscribers, and how to reduce your churn. And that's just scratching the surface. Getting one of these variables wrong can mean all the difference in determining whether a subscription business succeeds or fails. That's why I convened a panel of experts to dive into the nuances of subscription economics and identify the strategies that will increase your chances for success. They include Peter Ericson, CEO of the Leaky Paywall subscription platform, which helps publishers seamlessly build their audience and grow paid subscriptions; Michael Donahue, CEO of Subtext, a platform that allows publishers to send text messages to their paid subscribers; Jane Friedman, founder of The Hot Sheet, the most successful paid newsletter that covers the book industry; and Randy Cassingham, founder of This Is True, possibly the world's first paid email newsletter. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. This episode is actually a recording for my live office hours series. Twice a month, I pick a topic and then recruit experts on this topic. Then my audience joins a live call where they're able to interact with these experts in real time. There's only one way to participate on these calls, by becoming a paid subscriber to my newsletter. If you're a paid subscriber, not only do you get invited to each call, but you get a recorded video of it in case you weren't able to make it. To subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Okay, let's jump into the discussion. The title of this session is Let's Talk About Growing Your Subscription Business. Not surprising that we got a lot of people in here. This is kind of, top of mind for just about every publisher in existence who either is running their own subscription platform or is thinking about launching subscriptions or memberships or some kind of recurring payments. Obviously, there's a huge boom in subscriptions right now, not just on the publisher side, but the creator side. And it's also gotten really crowded. So it's getting more competitive. You're dealing with subscription fatigue. Obviously, there's some macroeconomic factors at play with the economic downturn and subscribers getting a little bit harder to convert. Those are all, the kinds of things we're going to talk about today, about how to create really great free content that's going to bring more people into the top of the funnel, how to convert them into paying subscribers, what to offer on the paid front, how to reduce churn. Hopefully we're going to cover all of that today. And we got a great list of we've got a great bunch of featured guests this week. One is Peter Ericson. He's the CEO of Leaky Paywall, which is a subscription platform, I think, that's built on WordPress, but Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, which is created around helping publishers build their audience and grow their paid subscriptions. We have Michael Donahue. I don't know if he's joined yet. He might have been one of the many people coming in. But he's the CEO of Subtext, and that's a platform that allows publishers to send text messages to their paid subscribers. And there are lots of outside the box strategies that a lot of his creators who use his platforms have used. We have Jane Friedman. She's a founder of The Hot Sheet, which is a really successful paid only newsletter that covers the book industry. And finally, we have Randy Cassingham, who might have the honor, it's hard to verify this, but he might be the creator of the world's first paid email newsletter. He launched his newsletter all the way back in the mid 90s and started monetizing it with subscriptions, I think in the early 2000s. So we've got a really great bunch here. Oh, Mike Donahue is here. Awesome. We've got a great bunch here, and they have a lot to offer. So let's just jump right into it. Peter, I was hoping maybe we could start with you. I always like to start with kind of the macro view of the topic before we get more granular. So it's been more than a decade. I think it was 2010 that the New York Times famously launched its paywall, and it kicked off the industry's pivot to subscriptions. And I think back then it had a meter paywall that allowed some absurd number of free articles, something like 20 free articles a month before you even saw the paywall. When you're looking at the subscription landscape today, which has gotten a lot more competitive, a lot more crowded, but also a lot more sophisticated, you see a lot of publishers doing much more sophisticated stuff than they were doing now. What are some of the ways that the publishers that you're working with, that they're getting more sophisticated with their subscription strategies? What are the trends that you're noticing within the last year or two in terms of how publishers are getting smarter about their subscription strategies?
Oh, that's a big question. The quick answer is if you look at the New York Times, yeah, they used to do 20. They went to 10 free articles a month and 5. Then they said, oh, heck with that. We're just going to give you 1 and you have to register for free. And that is really the big secret today. Maybe it's not a secret, but you need to nurture your audience, every publisher that has content. And we work with news and magazine publishers. They all pretty much say the same thing. Hey, we got tons of traffic. We get absolutely tons of visitors to your website. How do you convert paid subscribers? And you can't ask them to pay on the first date. That just doesn't work. So you set up a reg wall, a registration wall, a free registration, and you essentially use the freemium model where you're giving, you're stopping your readers that are inbound after 1 or 2 articles, let's say, and you're saying, hey, get some more content for free, maybe a few free articles, and the New York Times even says that, plus our newsletter, and don't undervalue the value of your newsletter, of course. And that converts really well. So now you have somebody who's free, who's logged into your website. You can target them appropriately with the right messaging. And then over time, they'll convert. And there's some data around that as well. So that's a quick answer.
Yeah, I think like with registration walls, like I agree with you that publishers are getting much more aggressive with them. I feel like it adds a lot of friction, especially when I'm visiting a website for the first time and I have to go through all the rigmarole of signing up for an account. Is the main motivation there is to just get them so that you can actually so that they can't escape using incognito mode or multiple devices, or is it mainly to get them on your email list where they're more likely to convert if you're building like daily habits?
Email list for sure. And it's a purposeful piece of friction to register, right? And so you have to offer value for that. And then the value is in the free content you're going to give them and the newsletter that you're going to give them. But then you get them registered in the system, and then you can speak to them, in a much deeper way. And that does work. I hear a lot of oh geez, I don't want to, nobody reads newsletters anymore. And I think this crowd doesn't believe that. And it's true. Of course, people read newsletters. That's, they opt in. And when you give them that piece of friction and they get over your piece of friction, now you got somebody who's, much higher value than a newsletter pop-up on a website, right? And you get some zombie subscribers in there and such and then your list grows. And then of course you can get sponsorships against that and things get better.
Yeah. And what about like from a data perspective, like if someone is logged in and registered, is it easier for a data analytics team to kind of design their paywall to hit them at the right time or to monitor their user habits so that they can better design their offerings or anything like that?
I mean, simple things work today. You don't have to get super fancy. You can target them simply by the fact that they are a logged in free registered user, first of all. So it's like, hey, we see that you've registered, please support us by upgrading. Or you can target them by like category of content that they're in. So if they're hitting a certain category and your messaging says, hey, we see that you love sports, get more sports news if it's a local publisher. And what I find is, we deal with a lot of publishers. We deal with startups that are really aggressive, and we also deal with some mid-market publishers like magazine publishers. They may have subscriptions in the 20,000-40,000 range, and there's still, the fundamentals are still not being met. Like a registration wall is still kind of new, and even if they're doing it, they may not be doing it the right way.
Yeah.
So
I've noticed like The Guardian and a few other publications do soft registration walls. Like they have like a pop-up that really kind of pushes people to registering, but you could still, if you look, where to look, you can click out of it. I mean, do you think like that might be kind of like a middle ground in terms of, creating too much friction, or should they just go with the hard registration wall?
We have a feature you can turn on or off to block incognito browsing, which is, I'd say, the hardest thing you'd want to do. But there are publishers that absolutely don't want that. If it's sort of philosophical. If I want to get around the system, let them get around the system. And then Just this week, I got a bunch of publishers that were talking about what is it called? 12, the 12 steps, the 12 ladder. I can't remember what it's called. And there are lots of these sites where you can drop in a URL and you can get around the paywall, right? Because it just strips everything out and you get the content. And they're all worried about that. Well, it's really the wrong thing to be worried about. Like, who cares? Like, if somebody's going to do the work and spend the time to get around a paywall, they're not going to pay you for a subscription. You know, we live in a world of, you know, like, where time is so valuable. We just want a convenient, you know, easy to use solution. That's, yeah.
Yeah, we have Malcolm Moore from the Financial Times. I don't know if he feels comfortable talking about this at all. If not, that's completely fine. I don't want to put you on the spot. Obviously, the Financial Times, has a very hard paywall. But so Malcolm, if at any point you do want to speak up on any of this, love to hear from you. But in the meantime, Jane, you've been running the Hot Sheet, which is a book industry. So it's like a niche industry newsletter for several years, kind of keeping with this whole theme of what we've learned over time. If you could go back in time to when you just started the Hot Sheet, what are some lessons that you've learned about in terms of the kind of content that people are willing to pay for, and also the different conversion strategies that you've learned over time since then?
My situation is a little unique in that I'm more or less a one-woman operation, and I already have a pretty extensive business outside of the paid newsletter. So essentially what happens is that my separate free newsletter, my blog, my speaking, my teaching, all of those things mention at some point, if you're ready to level up, or if you're very serious about your publishing career, I also have this paid newsletter. But the nature of authorship is that most people stay in that beginner stage. They don't really advance to the point where they need the paid newsletter that I have, which has very advanced information. So I have something of an interesting challenge in that I'm trying to keep inappropriate people off of that list, because I'm widely known for providing beginner information, but the paid newsletter is not beginner. So that's always been my kind of struggle in making sure people are prepared for what they're going to find in that newsletter, so that I don't have an insane amount of churn or people dropping off after the first month or so. And there is a free trial, so people can determine if this is really the information that they want. So my best conversion comes from people who they have probably engaged with me in some form over time, and they read some trend article I've done, or they attend a trend talk, and then they decide to take the jump into the paid newsletter. When I first started it, this was in 2015, the big mistake I made was not immediately putting that content into a content management system. It was just being sent via email. I wasn't really taking a long-term perspective. I wasn't expecting it to last as long as it did. And so I had to go through this very painful process of going back over like a 5 or 6 year archive and then getting it loaded into WordPress, which is the CMS that I use. So I think that like for anyone starting a newsletter today, I don't know that they would make that sort of key error, but it's one that I've been struggling with over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned is something I think unique about you is like, I don't think you don't really create a lot of free content. Most of your newsletter, your paid newsletter, most of the content you create is just for that paid newsletter. But you, as you mentioned, you speak at a lot of industry events. Like, you do a lot of stuff that's outside of like web content, a lot of analog stuff that helps you drive subscriptions for the newsletter. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's like something a lot of people on this phone call don't even think about.
Yeah, so in the writing and publishing industry, there are countless regional and national events for writers. Agents and editors attend, people from the industry attend. And so I go to a lot of those events. Sometimes I report on them because they have valuable information and that goes into my newsletter. But that's where I can engage with hundreds, if not thousands of people at a time through these events. Now, during the pandemic, obviously, a lot of that went online, but it's the same effect. And the other thing that I do on my own is offer a lot of my own online classes, which again is just, I mean, we're talking about like 3 to 4 online classes per month, not that I'm teaching, but that I'm hosting with other people. And then the other thing that I benefit from is just having spent 25 years in the same industry. So I kind of know everyone at this point, and everyone knows me. And so I actually generate a considerable number of third-party subscription sales. So other organizations like Bowker, which issues ISBN numbers for the book industry, or universities that sell subscriptions through their bookstore for students who are studying the publishing industry. I also get a lot of benefit from those satellite marketing and promotion efforts. And then basically every writing organization in the country knows about my newsletter and then offers a discount to their members. So like the Authors Guild, the Romance Writers of America, the Mystery Writers of America. So a lot of my marketing is very industry focused.
How do they benefit from recommending your newsletter?
Other than providing it as a benefit to members, that's it. Although there is one particular organization where I have a syndication deal where they market and promote my newsletter, and then they get to run basically 10% of the paid content in their own member, like walled off member area. So they're responsible for selecting that content. For me, it's hands off, and then I just approve it. And so it's kind of like special content brought to you by Jane Friedman at the Hot Sheet. So those partnerships are really useful.
Interesting. And anybody who has any questions for Pete, Jane, or anybody else, feel free to speak up, unmute, ask questions in the chat. But in the meantime, Michael Donahue, you run this platform called Subtext, which is a little bit different from the other platforms here. In that the thing that you're locking behind a paywall is this ability to text message with journalists, creators, publishers, whoever's running it. I think when people first hear of your platform, they have this negative reaction. They're like, oh, well, if I'm charging $5 a month for a subscription, that's not going to pay for me to be able to have these personal back and forth text messages with 1,000 different members. But that's not really how your creators, your publishers use that. Can you talk about like how you can incorporate text messaging into a subscription offering? Like how like some of your top creators and publishers are doing it?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, for the most part, there's really kind of 2 models that we operate off of. So we have a license model for media companies, large and small, right? Or, for individual artists, athletes, that type of thing. So in that scenario, like you're licensing the platform ultimately, and then you're typically making it free as like a value add to existing subscribers. So the goal there is to reduce churn or create a more participatory experience for those subscribers, in the hopes that, people find a more human element in the digital subscription product that they're purchasing, right? So it's sort of bundled in that scenario. And then, of course, we have a use case much more popular in the creator space and sort of the DIY space and that type of thing, where, very much like Substack, right? You can set a price and you can charge, whatever you see fit ultimately each month to, have people be a part of this private community. And so, I mean, you're right. I mean, you can do the math and say, like, well, if I'm charging $4.99 a month or something like that, what is the likelihood that, I not only get enough subscribers to make it worthwhile, but that, as that number goes up, I don't have sort of, a depleting value, right? In terms of like being a member of that community. But I can tell you that, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, on both fronts, like we work with most major media companies, right? On, the subscriber churn reduction, subscriber engagement side, right? So that's News Corp or the Washington Post or any variety of folks like internationally as well. But we have scenarios, and I just kind of float this out there, and it's totally anecdotal, but like I can't tell you how many emails we get on a daily basis that for whatever economic reason, right, somebody needs to unsubscribe to this publisher, this individual journalist, and they're like, hey, look, I've got to unsubscribe, but please don't tell Simon. And I think what's really interesting about that is sort of the more personal value that people ascribe to the medium. And, you know, I mean, even doing this at scale, right? So we sent, I think, 5 billion text messages in 2022. You know, we're seeing churn reduction rates at 20, 22, 25%. So, you know, really compelling. And then on the on the paid subscription side, right? So, you know, we're talking about sort of supplemental revenue streams. If you have a podcast or if you're a popular Twitch streamer or YouTuber or something like that. I mean, we have a guy on our platform today who is a sports handicapper, right? And he came to us and he was like, hey, look, I've only got like a couple thousand subscribers, but they're really, really dedicated. I provide like a really unique value to these folks. I want to build my business on Subtext, and I'm going to charge $100 a month to do it. And we're like, whoa, like that's crazy. $100 a month. You're an individual guy. And, you know, I mean, fast forward to today, I think he's going to gross $400,000 on the platform. So, you know, the barrier to entry in terms of creating text is very low. Open rate, CTR, and the engagement rate is really, really high. And again, this is sort of a bilateral medium, right? So it's a really good way for subscribers to any type of campaign to be able to participate.
Yeah. And so to kind of translate some of the stuff you're saying is, one thing is you're saying that text messages are a great another touch point for like any kind of paid subscription or membership, like in the same way that newsletters are, in the sense that it kind of creates like another layer of intimacy and loyalty and stuff like that, because they're inviting you not just into their inbox, but onto their phone. But I think like another important part is, you know, that person who's charging $100 a month aside, is it's not expected that you're answering every single text message coming in, that most of the publishers are using the text messages as a broadcast medium where they're sending something like almost like tweets, short curation, short, like, you know, I know like several sports journalists use it where like if there's like a draft day or something like that, they're sending text messages commenting on news that's breaking live. And yeah, they'll interact a little bit with people who text back, but it's not expected that they're answering every single text message that's coming to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% right. So we did a really fun one with Matthew Iglesias when he was still at Vox, right? And this was meant to be a live Q&A session during the presidential debates where, you know, instead of sharing information on Twitter and sort of having it lost in the algorithm, he was going to be sharing it directly with his audience, and he was going to be fielding questions, right? And there's no way he's going to be able to get back to every single person one-on-one. But I thought what he did that's really interesting is sort of use the inbox, basically the software that we're providing. He's scanning through and sort of answering for the group the most popular questions, maybe getting back to a handful of people one-on-one. But there's a number of different ways you can indicate that you're listening. That doesn't mean, you know, you have to get back to each person individually, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, we just did Miley Cyrus's album release, right?
Yeah.
And like, there's no way that she is going to get back to all of her fans, but, you know, you can hold out really interesting information or highlight a couple fans and show that, you know, you are listening and this is really, you know, bilateral medium.
Yeah, and that gets to the kind of case study that I think is the ultimate case study of using subtext. Is you don't have to lock content behind beyond a paywall. You can create this feedback loop. So one of the best use cases of your platform was this sports pop podcaster who was really popular, and he has a segment on his podcast where he would take questions from the audience. And before he started using subtext, he was taking those questions from Twitter, but then he launched paid subscriptions on subtext. So he had a segment every single podcast episode on his free podcast where he would answer questions and respond to, things from the audience. But the only way you could ask a question or give that feedback is if you were a paying subscriber of Subtext. So that not only gave him prompts for the content he was creating, he was able to keep that content 100% free, and he was able to create a feedback loop because every time he did that Q&A segment, he was promoting the Subtext subscription, which was, creating FOMO for the free subscribers to where, they wanted to be able to participate. So they would go, every single episode he was generating more paying subscribers to that. So I just thought that was kind of like an ingenious type of feedback loop that he was creating without locking any content behind a paywall. Randy, you have been doing this longer than just about anybody here. Not to date your age or anything like that, but
I'm still very young.
yes. So like, do you feel like it's getting easier to get people to subscribe because it's becoming more normalized? Like when you launched, like the idea of paying for content on the internet was, pretty much a non-starter. Like most publishers just assumed it wouldn't even work. Do you feel like it's becoming easier because more people are getting used to it? Or do you think it's becoming harder because there's, so much competition? There's this idea of like subscription fatigue.
And I'll correct you from your earlier intro. 1997, January 97 is when I started paid subscriptions. So it's been working out pretty well. And the answer to your question is both. We've got a lot more things to choose from. We've got a lot more sites that are just soaking up people's times, like Facebook. I would like to rail against Facebook because it's so mindless. You call it doom scrolling. You don't call it reading or engaging. So I'm finding that it's a little bit better to appeal to people who are looking for something a little bit more mindful instead of mindless. And that is the easier part. And the harder part, of course, is just the huge amount of distraction and competition that didn't exist in 1997.
Yeah. Could you think of anything within the last like 3 years or so, in which you've changed your strategy or tweaked your strategy in terms of content offerings or ways to drive conversions in this kind of more crowded social media market?
No, because I kind of flex every week. I mean, I try not to make my pitch the same. I have a free newsletter, of course, and then I've got the paid newsletter, and it's a freemium model because the free newsletter is the same content, it's just a lot less of it. I'll try different things, and here's what you missed, or even not being really specific about what the content was. And there were 4 stories on this subject, or there was this on the other thing, or there was a follow-on from this story that you thought was pretty cool. So I just try to mix it up and do something different every week.
Yeah. And that's something that I tell a lot of creators is like, I see way too many publishers, creators just copying and pasting the same calls to actions every week. I try to write something original every single time.
Exactly.
Always be experimenting, because if you just copy and paste the same thing over and over again, then your free readers kind of train their eyes to know what they're looking at before they even start reading it and just skip over it. Whereas if you're constantly refreshing your calls to action, your copy, you're constantly experimenting with new, think of yourself almost as like an ad pitchman who has to come up with new taglines and stuff like that to get people's attention. Like I think that's something that a lot of publishers are just not experimenting with.
And I also don't put it in the same place every time. I will move it around. I mean, my layout doesn't give me, unlimited places to put it, but it's not in the same exact spot every week.
Yeah. Pete, you seem to be agreeing with that notion.
Sorry, got to find my mouse. Yeah, no, right. Great, Mark. It's like, I remember coming into this business and thinking, oh my God, publishers have so much opportunity with different, products and subscriptions, of course, and they can go at it so many different ways. But the reality is like, the most effective thing is to teach one thing that actually works, and it's just vary that, a bunch of different ways. So you have a certain marketing message that's core to your brand, like just find 1,000 different ways to say the same thing essentially.
Yeah.
And just repeat, and it gets boring to you, but it's not boring to all the new people that run in, or the old people that just all of a sudden catch your message because you promoted your brand in a slightly different way. Same message, just different way.
Tony,
And
you
Tony
suggest,
says
Tony,
Tony says in the chat that if you hate writing these, you might mess around with Chat GTP, which is not a bad idea.
Yes.
Tony, have you tried that?
No comment.
Come on.
No,
we're
I mean,
all-
occasionally I mess around with it and just sort of seen, you always have to modify it. You can't just let it do it. But it is interesting. If, at the end of the day, your brain is tired, you don't want to write another promo. You just say, give me 10 promos, and maybe one is kind of directionally right, and you just sort of modify it. I mean, I hate to admit it, but
Or
I've
put
messed-
in
I've messed around with it.
or write a bad promo and say, hey, make this better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it's better than firing content creators and handing it over to ChatGPT if you're just doing it for the marketing side. Mignon, you had a question for Mike Donahue about using text messaging in your subscription strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This sounds so interesting. And, I do writing tips. It would be almost trivial for me to put out a useful writing tip by text every week and maybe a link to more information. But nothing strikes fear into my heart more than like 1,000 people expecting me to answer grammar questions for them or help them with their homework. And, I always feel really obligated when people send me questions. So how do you set expectations really so that people aren't going to think they can text you for personal help?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, like I said, we're used to operating at like a really, really big scale, right? So we have a few things built into the platform that can help with, the scaling of personalization, right? And like, I'll come back to that. But even just on the most basic level, I mean, whenever somebody signs up for a campaign, right? So they're affirmatively opting in to receive those texts, they actually get a custom welcome message from you and your voice with your contact card and everything like that. And we typically say like, that's a really effective place to sort of set the ground rules for like what you're going to be sharing, the frequency with which you'll be able to get back to people. And then, typically what we say is like, look, if you send out a broadcast, right, to 1,000 folks and 20 people get back to you with the same question, that might be something that is worth addressing to the broader group, right? It's like, something trivial, like when do I use affect versus effect or something, right? And like, a lot of people would have a question like that. And it's always it's a bit of a champagne problem in the sense that people really want to be able to engage with you there. But answering the sort of broader questions for the group is typically helpful. The other thing that we do as a platform, so when you send questions, let's say like, we do this with Punchbowl News and a few other folks in terms of like audience polling, like one of the things that we'll do is actually listen for keyword responses, right, in the platform. So do you prefer candidate A, candidate B, or product A or product B? As people start getting back to you, we'll actually listen for those keywords and we'll create new audiences associated with them. So the next time you just want to send a message to the people that said they favor candidate A over candidate B, you can start sort of winnowing down the audience and like scaling personalization based on declared sentiment from that audience. And then, we do a lot in terms of like, when you said, answering grammar questions, like we're doing something right now, not to harp on it, with the Washington Post, which is like, I think 30 days to like home improvement, success, right? Or so, something really fun like that. And what they're doing is you sign up on day one, you get sort of a tip a day for 30 days. And that sort of staggers out the broadcast that individuals are getting. It staggers out questions and it makes it easier if you want to be able to engage on a more personal level to be able to do that. Hopefully that answers your question, but.
Yeah, so that's more like a limited time drip course.
Exactly. We actually call it like a drip campaign.
And to be clear, like even though they're receiving it on their phones, Mignon, the way that it works on the creator side is you have like a web interface that you're, from your computer. So it's a little bit easier for you to manage. And Mike, would you suggest like maybe to like, if someone was serious about the strategy, maybe just instead of just responding in real time, designating like an hour a day, just like, okay, this is when I'm going to sit down and answer questions or respond to people who've come in. So then you're dealing with that fire hose in a responsible way that doesn't overwhelm everything else.
Yeah, well, and I mean, it's a great way to be able to use the medium, which is like more direct and not sort of subject to algorithmic interference. So like we have a lot of posts on our platform that will say, look, Simon, maybe we do this, right? It's like, hey, from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. on Thursdays, I'm going to be doing my office hours. Send me your questions here. I'm going to get back to you. And, you're going to see them in real time. You can get back to people one-on-one and that type of thing. But like, you can time box your engagement, right? And you're letting the audience know, like, hey, look, I'm going to be available at these times to answer your questions. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And that's proven to be really successful as well.
Yeah. So Pete, going back to the whole idea of like what converts people, obviously the largest publishers like the New York Times, they're putting out such a huge volume of content that they're just putting some kind of metered paywall, whether it's just a strict meter or a dynamic paywall, stuff like that. A lot of small publishers, they're just not producing enough content to justify a meter. So a lot of them use like freemium models where they're creating some kind of free content to build their audience, and then they're trying to entice them to convert into paid audience by offering some kind of premium content offering. If you were giving advice to a publisher who was just starting out about like what to create on the free side and what readers will value enough on the paid side, what kind of advice would you give about how to think about those two different sides?
I'd say if a creator doesn't know what the difference is between what is premium and what is free, don't do that, to actually just have a really restrictive meter. So in other words, it's work to create free content and then to create what you call premium content. And with some publishers, I know some real niche publishers, they do it really well, like Thomas Bechdel. I don't know if you know him. He does consulting for the media industry. He's got his plus content. He writes, 30 pages for some analysis on something, and then he's got his free content. But that's sort of a rarity where we'll deal with a lot of publishers, like magazine publishers. They have their premium content is their magazine content, and they'll start bringing it on the website, and then they start selecting, well, this news is free and this magazine article is premium, and then we'll do this. And the problem is that for most publishers that are getting going in a niche, you just want all your content to be premium. It's original content. You want it to be great. And each reader coming in has an opinion of what they consider content important to them or not. And that's why the meter works so well, because the inbound reader gets to choose, oh, this is the one I want to read. So you give them one free article. Okay, I get to read that article. Now I go to the next article that I want to read. Oh, wait, no, I have to register or pay or whatever. Okay, so that now the meter is doing the job of the decision making. So like, we have a publisher, Small Boats Monthly. They're up in Maine. They do this long form, how to build high-end wooden boats publication. And what they do is super restrictive. They have the meter set to one article a month for free. And then their free registration lets you read one more article period forever. It's super restrictive, and it converts like crazy for them. So they're not messing around with like which is free and which is paid. They're just, it's all premium. Sometimes the quick articles are really high value to certain readers.
Well, one thing I've heard from people is when choosing free from a paid is like, if they can envision an article being shared on social media by a lot of people, that's the one they make free, because that's the one that's going to widen their funnel. Whereas they make the more kind of inside baseball posts, the ones that are kind of like would only really appeal to people who know who you are, know your brand. Like going back to Matt Iglesias, one thing he does for his paid subscribers is like, he calls it the mailbag, and he allows his paying subscribers to ask him questions, and then he uses those questions as prompts for an entire newsletter. Obviously that's a paid newsletter. Obviously that's appealing to hardcore Matt Iglesias fans. And so he's bringing people, but his free articles are the ones that get shared a lot on Twitter and stuff like that. I mean, do you agree with that kind of framing of how, thinking about what's going to appeal to the top of the funnel versus the bottom of the funnel?
Well, I agree. You got to try different things, and that can work. The weird niche article, even though it gets low views, will usually convert better than the wide article. And if you're going for SEO, you're writing really wide, general articles. And if you're going for thought leadership or whatever your niche is, sharing is really going to be the main distribution. But you can also, do things like make something valuable after a period of time too, which we do with some publishers. So it's like, okay, it's good for a day, and then you have to pay. So you can get the sharing going. Google will index it at least for a while, and then it gets locked down. But every publisher's got different needs. Really depends on the content and the audience.
Yeah. What about like outside the box type of thinking? And I want to open not just to you, Pete, but open up to anybody else and hear your interesting ideas on this. Like, obviously this office hours that you're on now is kind of an outside the box thing in the terms of, I had tried using paid newsletters, didn't really see much traction. I thought, okay, what can I offer paid subscribers that's truly different, more bespoke, get a little bit more personalized. And that's how I came up with this office hours series. And that's when I really started moving the needle in terms of conversions, in terms of like thinking outside the box and offering other things that, like access to a community or merchandise, different stuff like that. Pete, have you seen that work, or is anybody else on the call seen that work to any extent?
Well, magazine publishers, they do that all the time. Like if you're dealing with print publishers, they have a lot of products that they sell. Like events is a huge part of their income. And I was just at the niche conference down in New Orleans, and the thing that's really clear is that magazine publishers, I did a presentation down there, and maybe 10% of the room were running paid subscriptions of the magazine publishers. That's it, which was a little shocking to me. But they're more interested in ad sales, right? And really driving that, building their audience and ad sales. And they're starting to think about, subscriptions, but events and other products. But that's sort of magazine specific.
Okay, let's talk a little bit. Jane, I'd love to, hear a little bit from you. I haven't heard from you in a while. You're someone who, has kind of like a hyper focused niche. What are some of the things you're thinking about? Like, one of obviously the biggest problems that subscription publishers deal with is churn. And it's not just about growing your paid subscribership, but it's also about reducing your churn to any extent possible, so that you're not, going 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Do you do anything or have you thought about this in terms of like, how do you re-engage paid subscribers that might, have a high probability of churn, whether it's because of like a failed billing or anything like that?
I could do a better job. I'll just be very upfront that I know many best practices, which I do not practice because of time issues.
Yeah.
But I would say something that has helped me a lot, which is really basic, is just having an introductory sequence, which for me, it's a 3-part sequence. Since my newsletter only comes out every 2 weeks, it's pretty important that I start engaging with those folks right away, within a day or 2 of the sign up, since they might not receive anything for quite some time. And also because the newsletter covers, at least in my world, it covers so many diverse topics. In that intro sequence, I try to make it clear the many different ways that the industry gets covered. For traditional publishing, for self-publishing, for particular genres. So for me, making people aware that even if the next 2 issues don't specifically address your genre or your area of interest, I want to make sure you see in the archive what's been done within the last year or 2. Something else I do, and this is partly for upsell. Once I did get the entire archive available through the website, I created 2 different tiers. So there's an email only tier, which is cheaper, and then there's the email plus archive tier. And there are a lot of people who like to research the history of companies in publishing. Things tend to disappear, or there's a lot of fly-by-night operations. And so what I'm finding with the archive is that people like going back and seeing the record of how I've written about a company over 5, 6, 7 years. And so at the end of every single newsletter, I include a section, I call it Old Flames, hot sheet, old flames, haha. So saying like, what were we talking about 1 year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago? And so I link then to the archive. And if people are at a lower level, they're not going to be able to read it. But it also makes people aware of really the rich archive that exists and just how much work has already been done that they now have the ability to take advantage of.
Yeah, and I think that's a big challenge for a lot of publishers and creators is like they're so forward focused. They're always focused on what's the next piece of content coming out. They're not doing enough to expose their readers, their audience to their archive so that they can start providing more value. I'm sure maybe some of you have noticed in my own newsletter, I have created an in case you missed it link, kind of basically stealing Jane's idea where I'm always trying to push people towards those case studies in the archives. I don't even like point out like when it was published, because sometimes people don't want to click on something if they think it's old, but because this is like evergreen content. So I'm constantly like trying to get into the habit of trying to link to previous stuff. I also created kind of like a one-page sheet that embeds all of my videos for my office hours so that people who are becoming paid subscribers, they're not just getting invite, like you said, like I only do, like you only send your newsletter out once every 2 weeks. I only do this office hours once every 2 weeks. So I want to send them to a landing page that is exposed, where they can go back and start perusing their archives. Randy, you have 20 years of archives. Do you feel like you're doing enough to, expose your readers to that older stuff?
30 actually. I actually got the idea from you, from your Facebook post where you were talking about the evergreen content. What are you doing with that? And so I started creating a spreadsheet of interesting stuff that's available on my website, but it's pretty deep and pretty hard to find. And I call it Sunday reading. So every Sunday, a link comes out in my social feeds, and I also just grab that text and put it in my newsletters that week. Here's what the Sunday reading was. And it's just, old content, and I'm getting probably 500 to 1,500 clicks onto that every week. So that's really exposing people to a lot of my old stuff. It's really neat. So thanks for the idea.
Yeah. Pete, you said something about creating some kind of specialized email for it.
Yeah, I mean, back to smallboatsmonthly.com, go register for free, and you'll see how they handle their archives and their newsletter. They created a whole new email because they only email, I think they only used to email once a week, and now they're emailing, I think, 3 times a week, and they pull 2 articles that are related. They're pretty long form articles from their archive, and they just send it, and they've been doing that for at least over a year. It's been working well for them.
Yeah, there's just so much, stuff in the archive, and it's increasing the value of your subscription if they know that they don't have to wait for the next thing to come out in order for them to get value from it. The deeper that archive, the more that valuable the subscription is. But the problem is like, how do you get people interacting with that archive? Mike, you mentioned like subtext being used as another tool to reduce churn. Can you how do you think text messaging can be utilized on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few ways to be able to do it, or a few that we've had clients see success with. So the first one is getting people subscribed to individual journalists or maybe areas of subject matter that they're really interested in as they go through the sign-up funnel, right? So we do this with the New York Post, right? So if you are signing up to the Sports Plus subscription on the New York Post, you're going to pick the individual sports writers that you're the most interested in hearing from, right? So maybe you're a fan of the Rangers, you're a fan of the Knicks, whatever. So you go into their campaigns, and then they're sharing sort of behind the scenes looks at, what's happening in the locker room, or how people are preparing for a game, or, what they're hearing coming out of the draft and that type of thing. And what this tends to do is to limit the number of zombie subscribers that you have, because text messaging broadly in our platform sees this as well. I mean, the open rate is 98%. Right? And the vast majority of it happens in the first 10 minutes of somebody receiving a text. So they're immediately going to be regularly reminded of the value of their subscription. I think the other thing that it tends to do, aside from just like humanizing the organization and giving people a more personal stake in the subject matter that has an impact on their lives, is that, you know, you're capturing really valuable data and you're opening up a dialogue with the subscriber if you want to, right? So we do this with Gannett. They'll have questions of any of their digital subscribers, right? So let's say you have 1 million subscribers and you want to ask like, hey, what is going to be most impactful for us to share? How could you get more value out of this? Do you want to do live Q&As? Do you want to, you know, be able to participate in like some of our podcasts or some of the upcoming events we have? So just a lot of ways to be able to create more participatory experiences and to make sure that, you know, you're holding out a really differentiated value here. Because, you know, if you were to compare what the New York Post offers and, you know, maybe what the New York Daily News would offer in terms of sports coverage, you might get different personalities, right? But the access to those personalities is very different depending on where you're subscribing, right?
Interesting. I'd love to, you know, maybe hear from some other people on the call about what they're seeing that's working. Tegan, how you run a popular political blog, you launched a really successful membership platform. What like in terms of moving the needle, what have you learned? What are you doing today that you weren't doing when you first launched your membership in terms of exposing people to the paywall? What have you done to tweak it so that you're getting better conversions?
Well, so the thing that comes up is something I did in January is I launched a podcast, and it's a paid podcast just for members. So you need your own private feed to subscribe to it, and it comes out once a week. The reason that has been so successful so far, I believe, is that it's a different type of medium. So if you want to read what I have to say about politics, you can come to the website anytime, log in, see what I have to say. There's something that's very fundamentally different about a podcast where it's in your ears, you're consuming it while you're walking the dog or you're doing your dishes or whatever, or working out on a treadmill, and it's a much more personal thing. And what I have found is that it is really powerful at reducing churn because it becomes part of someone's behavior. Every Friday morning, they look forward to getting it in their feed on their phone, and whether they listen to it on Friday morning on their commute to work or whether they listen to it over the weekend, it becomes part of the routine. And anytime you can become part of their routine, it's kind of like that's gold in the media business, is to be part of someone's routine. And so anyway, that's my latest experiment that I have found great success with.
Yeah, there is really something there, I think, about the intimacy of hearing someone's voice and seeing that you don't get you know, from reading their stuff. I think that also plays into why Jane has seen so much successful with the public speaking and stuff like that. Would you agree, Jane, that like the someone seeing your face and hearing your voice in front of them is such a more powerful driver of converting them into paid subscriptions?
Yeah, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Tony, how about you? You run one of the most successful local paid newsletters, the Charlotte Ledger, on Substack. Have you anything that you've changed up within the last year or two that you feel like has, you know, improved your conversions, have provided more value, perceived value for your audience?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to do all the things sort of that you all have talked about, you know, fostering that sense of community, that sense of FOMO. I think one of the things that's important that I think I see a lot of newsletter creators sort of miss is that I think it's important to constantly be showing your free people what they're missing. I mean, I see creators that, you know, they'll have a paid version that'll just go to the paid people, and then they'll have a free version, and there's not a lot of crossover. Like, I think you constantly need to be pointing to, hey, all you free people, I did this great interview, or hey, here's some news we broke last week, or here's a really insightful piece. I feel like I don't really necessarily see that enough. I mean, one of the things that we do is that we, and I know Substack has this paywall tool now that they've put in there, but we have multiple articles in our newsletter. And so we'll send out a free version that has some truncated, in which they're truncated, and then we'll send out the paid version. We'll say, hey, if you want to see the full version of these articles, you know, you're going to need to pay. And so that's one thing that I see a lot of people, they don't do a great job of.
Yeah. And, you know, I held off on using that tool for the longest time because I was like, oh, you're just going to piss off your free list. You're going to create a bunch of unsubscribes and stuff like that. But you know what, that's fine. You're giving them tons of free content. Like that, you know, the cost of that free content is sometimes you have to annoy them with you know, your paywall, or some kind of paid product or something like that. And this week was my first week when I announced this office hours session. I sent it to the free list, but the only thing that was cut off behind the paywall was the actual Zoom link. And yeah, I did have a higher than average number of unsubscribes from the newsletter, but that also today, this week was one of my best weeks in terms of paid conversion. So I think, you know, I agree with you, is you got to get more, for lack of a better word, annoying. You need to force them to hit that paywall, because the paywall is what converts.
Yeah, I think you don't want to do that too much. I do think you see better conversions on that, but there are ways to do that that are maybe less annoying. Like some people, we do this too, like a weekend roundup, like, hey, here's all the stuff we had. And it's, you know, we'll give you a little summary of everything we had. But obviously, yeah, if you want to read it, you're going to hit a paywall. But just, I mean, you know, if the open rate, if you have a good open rate of 50%, I mean, half the people are going to miss that you had it. So to keep, like, kind of like what you're saying, Simon, like going back to the, in case you missed it, hey, here's some related content. I mean, a lot of websites have automatically populating related content, but you know, we try and drive people to some of those relevant archives as well. So
yeah. And that kind of speaks to the utilizing your archives, is don't just utilize it to keep your paid subscribers happy, but also kind of keep on pointing your free subscribers to your archived content, because, you know, that might be what converts a free subscriber. An article that you had behind the paywall like 6 months ago that they didn't even know existed. So don't, you know, just rely on your new paywalled content to convert subscribers. Try to expose them to your older stuff as well. Anybody else seeing, before we're in our closing minutes, seeing anything that's really effective and works? Going,
I
Randy?
think probably one of the things that is most effective for me is, and part of this is my newsletter is pretty personality driven, and they're buying into me a lot. But I also really emphasize my mission. And my mission, I state in very simple words, and that is, I think we need more thinking in the world. So people who really engage with that mission and think that's an important thing are so much more likely to upgrade and pay extra. I actually let people choose how much they want to pay, and some of them pay hundreds of dollars when they don't have to, because they really engage in the mission. And I think that's super, super important if you can do that.
Yeah, and I think that's underrated by a lot of publishers. They assume that the only value your offer is like the content itself. But especially for smaller publishers or mission-oriented publishers, you know, like, don't underestimate the power of people just wanting to support you. You know, I have podcasters that I subscribe to on Patreon. I only listen to their free content. I never listen to their paid content, but I'm still a subscriber on Patreon just because I want to support them. You know, never underestimate that as, you know, a motivator. I think that's hard to do for larger companies. Like I know that Vox Media and BuzzFeed have experimented with you know, soliciting donations, and I'm not super excited about giving a donation to a venture funded media, but especially for smaller publishers, don't underestimate that as a motivating factor. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much to our esteemed guest. I'm always honored that people take their time to come over here and share their expertise. I love doing these every other week, and it's a lot of fun. And as always, reach out to me if you have any ideas for future office hours sessions, guests that I should have on. Always happy to have that kind of feedback. Okay, everybody, have a great rest of your week.